Welcome to the game preview breakdown video of Notre Dame versus Duke here in week 5 of the 2023 season. I'm going to walk through the statistics for each team, how the matchups shape up, and where I think the model is keying in to predict its spread. I have another video where I explain the game previews and power indexes in more detail, so if you want more info on the stats and models themselves, please go take a look at that video. I'll link it in the description. Okay, to start off, there are actually a total of 5 different machine learning models that are being used in this preview. One for spread, one for win percentages, one for game total, and one each for yards per pass attempt and yards per carry. They're each completely independent of each other and even use different sets of statistics. The idea there being more information to help you shape your expectations of the game and what to watch for. For instance, if Team A is favored in the spread, but Team B is favored by the win percentages, there's likely to be more variability there in the outcome and might be one you want to avoid from a betting perspective. Or you might just believe one over the other after looking at the other stats and matchups. One other thing that I want to point out before I dive in is that machine learning models are inherently black boxes. I don't know what weight it puts to which stat, especially since different stats play with or against each other, and they do so to varying degrees depending on other stats. So I don't really know with certainty why a model predicts what it does. What I do know, though, is what stats it uses as inputs, and anecdotally, after looking at a lot of these over time, you can start to see a pattern around certain stats. So as I do more of these videos, hopefully you can start to see and notice patterns of your own that help you read these sheets more quickly and effectively. All right, let's dive into the game. So to start off, the spread on this game is at 5.5. And the over-under is at 51. These I pull on Monday mornings, so they definitely could have changed. I don't know what they are as of this recording, but these are the numbers that I run with in my tracker. So starting off with the projected spread actually has Notre Dame at -14. So pretty big difference from the Vegas spread, over a touchdown. And the model also predicts a 62-point total. Now, I will caveat that I'm still kind of a little iffy on my total predictions right now. I think they lean a tad high right now and probably needs a little tweaking, so I wouldn't really rely on that number right now too much. In terms of the win probability, we've got Notre Dame at 80.2% and then Duke at 19.8%. So pretty wide spread, what you'd expect given the projected spread on this game as well. All right, so I'm going to start out by just going through the matchups in this game. And then once we do the matchups, I'll kind of key in on some other statistics outside of those, unit on unit matchups. So starting off with the passing offenses. Brief explanation of power index. Power index is just an opponent-adjusted way to see how good you are at a given facet of the game. It's kind of a one-base scale, one being more or less your average team. So if you have an average passing attack of 1, you're just average. If you have a passing attack rated 2, you're more or less twice as good as your average team. Conversely, on the defensive side, if you have a power index of 0.5, you're twice as good on defense as your average team. So the way these matchups work is basically you just multiply the power index of the offense versus power index of the defense, and wherever that kind of lands, that's who wins the matchup. So you can see, for instance, starting off with Notre Dame's passing offense, they have a power index of 1.76, which is actually 5th in the country, so definitely upgraded passing attack this year. And then Duke's defense on passing is rated 0.57, so also very, very good. That's good for 8th in the country on defense. So kind of strength on this one according to the stats. So just to kind of go back to what I was saying earlier about multiplying, like the 1.75 times 0.57 ends up to where it's just about even, like very, very slight lean into Notre Dame's favor, but only just slightly. So that's pretty even. This is where our yards per attempt model comes in. So the yards per attempt does take more into account than just the straight, passing offense and defense power index. There's a lot more that goes into it, success rates and whatnot. But I think it's where a good place to highlight what the projected yards per attempt is for Notre Dame in this game, which is 8.72. So moving on to Duke. Duke's passing attack is 1.1. So it's good, but not great. That's good for 50th in the country. Notre Dame's passing defense is very good, not quite elite, but very good at 0.77. So between those two, Notre Dame is projected to kind of win that matchup just slightly. And then that leads to a projected yards per attempt for Duke of 7.4 yards per attempt. Moving on to the rushing offenses, we've got Notre Dame's rushing offense with a power index of 1.6, which is very good. That's good for 16th in the country in rushing. Duke's defense numbers, their defensive rushing is where they're a little bit not so great. They're rated 0.92, which is better than average, but only just. So that's good for 61st in the country. So Notre Dame wins this matchup pretty handily, and I believe, it's outside of success rate and talent, it's the matchup that they win the most handily, and this gives Notre Dame a projected yards per carry of 4.75 in this game. So flipping over to Duke's rushing offense, Duke has a very, very good rushing offense, power index of 1.72. That's good for 11th in the country. Notre Dame's rushing defense is rated at 0.75, which is kind of same as their passing defense. It's good, not elite. It's 33rd in the country, so it's pretty good. But Duke actually is projected to win this matchup, and their projected yards per carry is 4.3, let's call it. I will point out that I think the large driver of Duke's very good power index is their game against Clemson. So if I look at the Clemson game results, Duke averaged, Duke had 6.6 yards per carry in that game when Clemson's averaging giving up 3.2. So they were over twice as good as Clemson usually allows. So that's really bringing their average way up. Not discounting it in any way, just kind of telling you where that number is kind of coming from. If you're raising an eyebrow at Duke's good, highly rated rushing attack, that is why. So moving down, this is kind of the composite here, is the total offensive and defensive numbers. So obviously passing PI and rushing PI are based on yards per attempt and yards per carry. And then the offensive and defensive PI are rated on yards per play. So you can kind of see sometimes where the power indexes for passing and rushing can be pretty far apart. Like, I mean, in this case, if you look at Notre Dame, they're rated 5th and 16th in passing and rushing respectively, but 4th in overall offense. So you kind of wonder why maybe if it's 5th and 16th, why it's not more in the 10th range. It's because it's based purely on yards per play, and it's based on yards per play that your opponents are usually giving up to, right? So if you face a really good passing defense and you put up okay numbers and you have a really good day rushing and it kind of skews your yards per play in a good direction, that's where this can kind of crop up a little bit. So just a little bit more background on that. But getting into the actual matchups, it's pretty even. Notre Dame's offense is 1.61, which is 4th in the country, so it's very good. But Duke counters with 0.69, which is good for 12th in the country. So, they're not too far off from each other. Notre Dame is projected to win this matchup, but again, only slightly. And then on the flip side, we've got Notre Dame's defense at 0.7 power index, and then Duke's offense at 1.29. So Notre Dame's defense is 16th in the country, and Duke's overall offense is rated 24th. So again, not too far apart from each other, but Notre Dame is projected to win this matchup as well. So those are the kind of unit-on-unit stats for those matchups. So now we're going to move on to explosiveness. So Notre Dame Notre Dame's offense is not super explosive, more efficient than explosive. And Duke's defense is pretty highly rated in defensive explosiveness allowed. We've got a power index of 0.64 for Duke in defense, which is ninth in the country. And then a power index of 1.09, which, like I said, is good but not great for Notre Dame. That puts them at 34th in the country. So Duke is projected to win this matchup, and it's their biggest win of all the matchups. Moving on to Notre Dame's defense and Duke's offense, in terms of explosiveness, Notre Dame's defense is a little bit susceptible to the explosive play on defense. They're rated 1.08, which, again, on defense, a higher number is worse. So they're actually worse than your average team in defensive explosiveness. That's a rank of 100th in the country, so definitely something that, to keep an eye on for Notre Dame in future matchups. But Duke's offense isn't super well equipped to take advantage of this, as they are 0.92 in offensive explosiveness, which is 78th in the country. And actually, despite being below average, Notre Dame is projected to still win this matchup just slightly. So moving on to success rate, this is where Notre Dame gets their biggest matchup win of all, where their offense has a power index of 1.6, which is good for 6th in the country for success rate on offense. And then Duke's defensive success rate is 0.99, which is right around average. That's 68th in the country. And so this matchup sets up very well for Notre Dame to be very efficient in this game. On the flip side, we've got Notre Dame's defensive efficiency it's good. It's not elite, but it is very good at 0.73, which is good for 25th in the country. And then Duke's offensive success rate is also very good at 1.36, which is good for 17th in the country. So this is kind of strength on strength. Notre Dame does win the matchup technically, but it is, again, very, very close. Finally, there are two other stats that are not unit by unit. They're not matchups unit on unit, but just kind of overall matchups between the two. There's Havoc and Talent. So in Havoc, Notre Dame is, again, good but not great in Havoc. They have a 1.07 power index there, which is 43rd in the country. Duke's Havoc rate is definitely better at 1.27, which is good for 26th in the country, and that gives Duke the advantage in this category. Finally, Talent. Notre Dame has a pretty heavy talent advantage in this one. These are purely recruiting rankings, and these are from College Football Data, which I believe use the 24/7 talent composites. So this is, again, recruiting only, not transfer portal. But Notre Dame definitely has a distinct advantage in this one with a value of 8th in the country versus Duke's 59th. So those are all the matchups. I guess in total, it looks like Notre Dame wins 9 of the 12 matchups, which is obviously very, very good. So I'm going to get into a couple more of the statistics outside of just, rushing and passing, and get into some consistency. So Notre Dame, not surprisingly, based on, a lot of these numbers are either elite or very good. Their consistency numbers are as well. So we have these stats, the deviation stats. So this is basically just the standard deviation of your stats in each game, right? So the standard deviation for Notre Dame's passing attack is 0.2, which is 31st in the country, which is pretty good. So this is just their consistently good passing attack. Their yards per carry deviation is even better at 11th in the country. So very, very good, consistent running team. Duke's is a little bit more unpredictable. So Duke's passing deviation is 0.29, which is 90th in the country. So while their average is, pretty good, their deviation is up and down a little bit. Their yards per carry deviation is much better at 0.25, which is 24th in the country. So they're more consistently good at running than they are at passing. All right, so I've already touched on the explosiveness numbers a little bit, so I don't think there's a whole lot more to go into there, and the Havoc as well. I think one stat that I've noticed the spread model really takes heavily into account, again, anecdotally from what I can tell, is points per opportunity. And so points per opportunity, there's a definition of it. I have it on the other video, but it's basically how many points you get off of good opportunities. So I think this is drives that go into your opponent's territory, maybe a 40. I don't remember exactly. But Notre Dame has a very, very good 4.91 points per opportunity, which is 7th in the country. And then Duke's is good, but not quite as good with 4.53, which is 20th in the country. So definitely advantage Notre Dame there, and I think this is where we start to see them pull away in kind of the spread. You know, they win all the matchups fairly closely, which would kind of align with that 5.5 point spread. But I think if you start adding in some of these other stats here, you can see where it starts to pull away just a little bit. The defensive side, Duke actually does have a slight edge in the defensive points per opportunity, where Notre Dame is giving up 2.81 points per opportunity, which is 29th in the country, whereas Duke is 2.62, which is 17th in the country. So, offsetting Notre Dame's edge just slightly in the offensive side, but still, Notre Dame does have a higher edge in offensive than Duke does in defensive, if that makes sense. The offensive points per score as well, Notre Dame has very good numbers in this regard. They're scoring 6.32 points per score. So obviously a very high touchdown rate there. That's 9th in the country. Duke has struggled a little bit more in that area. They are sitting at 4.3 points per score, which is 73rd in the country. So pretty, close to the middle of the pack there. Definitely need more touchdowns in this game if they're going to hang with Notre Dame. And so they need to see that number improve a little bit. The offensive plays per score, this is a new metric. I don't use this in any of the models, but I think it is an interesting metric just to look at on paper, where you kind of see how basically the total number of plays that you run per score. Both on offense and defense. Both these teams are pretty similar on both sides of the ball. I've got Notre Dame at 7.11 plays per score, which is 47th in the country, and then Duke at 6.07 plays per score, which is 35th in the country. So Duke does have a slight edge in that regard, scoring a little bit more quickly. The defensive side, both of these teams are excellent in this regard. Notre Dame at 29 plays per score, and Duke is at a whopping 37.75 plays per score, which is good for 4th in the country. So, if you're a team playing Duke, they're going to make you work for those points, which is definitely a notch in their favor. Plays per minute is purely just to give you an idea of pace. Notre Dame has a much higher pace than Duke does, so Duke is going to kind of draw it out a little bit more than Notre Dame. But yeah, those are all the stats in this game. The closest prior matchups is a section that we have. Gets a little bit more useful as teams get a little bit more games under their belt. Obviously, the closest prior matchup for Notre Dame is Ohio State, which was a game that they lost and scored, pretty small number of points for them, versus Duke's closer prior matchup is Clemson, a game in which they frankly dominated, thanks to definitely some mistakes from Clemson in that game, but credit Duke, they capitalized. So I think that's just about everything I wanted to touch on in this game. Just kind of going through the stats. Hopefully this was helpful, and if you're just listening, hopefully having the statistical rank of each value helped kind of give you some good context around the actual numbers. And that's a lot of numbers to keep track of just in your head. So I wanted to take a little bit of time here to talk about the matchup itself And to be honest with you, I'm going to try to stick to the statistics. There are plenty of other people out there who provide better breakdowns and deeper knowledge about, personnel and that sort of thing, scheme, all that stuff. I'm just going to focus on the numbers here because that's what I think is the value that I can provide here around this matchup. We've already gone through Notre Dame does win most of the matchups and more handily than others, but still, they win a lot of the matchups by a decent amount. But still, from going from 5.5 in Vegas to 14 in the model, it's a wide spread. So I'm going to kind of dig in a little bit deeper and see if I can find some justifications for that, just to back up what the model's putting out there. So looking a little bit deeper into Duke's results, especially their offensive numbers, like I said earlier, Duke's highly ranked in the rushing power index, and that all basically came from one game in the Clemson game. So like I said, they averaged 6.6 yards per carry in that game, whereas Clemson's usually giving up 3.2. They also averaged 6.7 against Northwestern. Northwestern's defense obviously is no Clemson, but they still only averaged 4.6, so still a very good performance. UConn was not so great for Duke. They only averaged 2.7 yards per carry in that game, and UConn usually gives up 3.8. So that was a pretty low performance for Duke there. Definitely gives you a little cause for concern. It's their average is still high because of the two good performances versus the one bad, but it's definitely, again, gives you a little pause there. On the flip side, for Notre Dame, they hit 6 yards per carry against Navy. They hit 4.6 against NC State, who has a surprisingly good average of 4.3. They hit 6.4 yards per carry against Central Michigan, and then they hit 4.5 yards per carry against Ohio State. And Ohio State actually has a very, very good rush defense. They are averaging only 3.1 yards per carry on defense. So that was a very good performance, 45% higher than what Ohio State usually gives up, which is what's driving, Notre Dame's, again, consistent and consistently good rushing attack. If we look closely at the projected yards per attempt and projected yards per carry for each team, Notre Dame's 8.7 and 4.75 is pretty closely aligned with kind of the average between the Navy and Ohio State. It's actually pretty interesting. They have obviously a threshold where they hit and just explode, right? So they have 7 yards per attempt against Ohio State and 4.5 yards per carry, but only managed to score 14 points. Now against Navy, they had 10.1 yards per attempt and 6 yards per carry, and they ended up scoring 42 in that game. So, it seems like there's probably a happy medium in there where if this comes out to 8.7 and 4.8 yards respectively, they're probably, going to score in, the high 20s, low 30s, just based on what they've done in previous games. For Duke, the projected is 7.4 and 4.3. So that actually is pretty close in the passing game to the UConn game. And they only averaged 2.7 yards per carry in that one as well. And they scored 41 points. So Duke has scored 28, 38, and 41 in their 3 games so far this year. But I think it's worth pointing out that 14 of those points from Clemson came on turnovers and short fields. So one of those touchdown drives was a good long drive, a 75-yard drive that did have a very long run from Riley Leonard to actually score the touchdown. Kind of in the same vein, in the UConn game, even though Duke scored 41 points, they only had one touchdown drive that was longer than 50 yards. So, more short fields given to them, or I guess earned by their defense, right? Like, not trying to take anything away, but these are not necessarily good predictors for playing a much more talented Notre Dame team. The last thing I wanted to look at was actually to see how Sam Hartman played against this team last year. Obviously, it's a different team from both sides, but just, what did he do last year against this Duke defense? Just to give us an idea of what maybe he can do in this one. And it's actually kind of interesting. He had 347 yards, 26 of 42, so a yards per attempt of 8.3. Had 3 touchdowns and 1 interception in this game last year, which is not too far off from the projected 8.7 from the model. So it's not anything to base any sort of prediction on necessarily, but it is another data point showing that it's definitely possible for Notre Dame to get this done.